Okay, so get this. We're going deep on a sermon about the Apostle Paul.
Okay.
But it all starts with this story about a park ranger,
Oh, wow.
Roy Sullivan.
Okay.
This guy was struck by lightning 7 times.
7 times?
7.
Oh.
It's like statistically impossible.
It really makes you wonder about, like, how much a person can actually take.
Right.
And that's where the sermon makes a really interesting connection to the Apostle Paul.
Oh, interesting.
Both of these guys, they face these crazy challenges.
Yeah.
Sullivan, obviously, with, like, the forces of nature.
Yeah.
And Paul with, like, just this intense opposition,
Oh.
especially from the Jewish community.
So we're using this sermon as like a way to figure out
Yeah.
the why behind Paul's actions
Right,
and that
where-
crazy perseverance.
Like, he just kept going.
Yeah, like never give up.
Never give up.
But first,
Yeah.
let's talk about this Roy Sullivan story.
Okay, so one detail that really stood out to me was this one time lightning actually struck Sullivan, like, through the open window of his truck.
What?
Yeah, knocked him unconscious.
Oh my gosh.
Singed his hair and eyebrows.
Can you imagine?
It's just wild.
That would be terrifying.
It's a crazy story.
And it says that after the 4th strike, he started carrying around a can of water
Why a can of water?
because his hair had caught fire so many times,
Oh, wow.
like from the lightning.
Jeez.
You have to wonder how those repeated encounters like shaped how he saw the world.
That's a good point.
Yeah.
It really makes you think, like, what does it take to just keep going after facing something like that?
Yeah.
And it's interesting because Sullivan later took his own life.
Oh, wow.
And that kind of shows us that even people who can overcome these, like, crazy external challenges
Yeah.
might still be struggling with stuff we don't see.
Really powerful insight.
It is.
And that brings us to Paul,
Okay.
who, like Sullivan,
Mm-hmm.
seems to kind of attract danger.
Yeah, he seems...
The sermon talks about a bunch of examples from the book of Acts,
Okay.
where Paul faces just intense opposition for the Jews,
Yeah.
like plots to kill him in Damascus and Jerusalem,
Wow.
attempts to turn Gentiles,
So, like, the non-Jewish people?
against him,
Right.
even a stoning in Lystra
The stoning.
that left him for dead.
Oh, my goodness.
It's intense.
It's important to understand
Very.
that this wasn't just random violence. There's a
Right.
reason behind it.
Okay.
It all came down to a disagreement about salvation.
Okay.
Paul's message that salvation comes through faith in Jesus Christ,
Mm-hmm.
it challenged what the Jewish people believed about the law of Moses.
Oh, I see.
Those rules and rituals they had followed for centuries.
It's like a clash of ideologies
You could say that.
with some very real consequences.
Very real.
And this sermon looks at Paul's own writings to make this point, right?
That's right.
Okay.
Instead of, like, quoting long passages.
Right.
It just sums up Paul's argument. It basically boils down to, look, you don't need to follow all these laws to be right with God.
Yeah.
The faith in Jesus is what matters.
Hmm.
And this was like a radical idea
Yeah.
for people who believed that the law of Moses was sacred.
It makes sense, though.
Yeah.
It wasn't just about, like, abstract theological ideas.
No, it was about their identity, their
Right.
traditions, their sense of belonging, their
Mhm.
whole lives, really.
But here's a question.
Okay.
Knowing all the risks,
Yeah.
why would Paul keep going back to the synagogues,
That's a good question.
the Jewish places of worship,
Right.
where he knew people would be hostile towards him?
Well, the sermon actually gives a few possible explanations.
Okay.
First, it points out that Paul felt really strongly about sharing the gospel with his own people.
Oh, so like a sense of responsibility.
Exactly.
Okay.
He really believed that they were missing out on God's grace by sticking to the law.
Okay.
And in Romans, he even expresses this deep sadness for his fellow Jews who had rejected Christ.
So it was partly out of love and concern for them.
Yeah. Even if it meant putting himself in danger.
But there's got to be more to it.
There's also a strategic element
Okay.
by going to the synagogues first.
Yeah.
Paul was showing God's faithfulness to his covenant with Israel. It was like he was giving them the first chance to hear the good news.
It's like he was saying, hey, I'm not abandoning you.
But this message is for everyone.
And I have to share it with the world.
Exactly.
But wasn't there also like a practical reason?
Yeah, that's a good point.
Like if he skipped the synagogues, wouldn't that make it harder to reach the Jewish community later?
It probably would.
Yeah.
So going to the synagogues first was smart, but also in line with his beliefs.
Okay, so we've got Paul, this former persecutor of Christians,
Right.
now risking his life to spread this message. That basically challenges everything the Jewish people believe.
It's a pretty bold move.
And then there's this whole light to the Gentiles thing.
Yeah, what's that all about?
What is that all about?
Well, the sermon connects Paul's mission
Yeah.
to this passage in Isaiah
Okay.
where God talks about making Israel a light to the Gentiles.
So they were supposed to share God's truth with the rest of the world.
That was the plan.
But the Jewish people mostly rejected Jesus as the Messiah.
Yeah, they did.
So did the mission fail?
Not exactly. That's where Paul comes in.
Mm-hmm.
As the apostle to the Gentiles.
Right.
Paul takes on that role of being a light to the nations.
So he's kind of picking up where Israel left off,
You could say that.
fulfilling that purpose in a new way.
It's a powerful idea.
But even with this divine mission,
Yeah.
Paul still faces all this opposition and violence.
Oh, it does.
The sermon even talks about this scene
Okay.
where Christ appears to Paul in a vision
Oh, wow.
and says, "Get out of Jerusalem quickly."
They won't accept your message.
It's kind of a reminder that even when you're doing what you think God wants,
Yeah.
you'll still face rejection and hardship. But Paul doesn't give up.
No, he keeps going.
He just keeps going.
He's incredible.
And that leads us to Lystra,
Right.
that crazy scene with the healing,
Yeah.
the near worship,
In your worship.
and then the stoning.
Intense.
It's like a
So-
microcosm of all the challenges Paul faces
It really is.
throughout his whole ministry.
That's a good point.
And that's where we'll pick up next time.
Sounds good.
So we left off with Paul facing some serious danger
Uh-huh.
in Lystra.
Right.
That whole scene,
Yeah.
the crowd wants to worship him as a god, and then they're stoning him.
People can be so fickle.
Really shows you how unpredictable people can be.
It does.
One minute they're praising you,
Yeah.
the next they're throwing rocks.
The sermon actually points out that
Okay.
this incident kind of reveals something about human nature.
What do you mean?
Like how easily we can get swept up in our emotions
Okay.
and how much we're influenced by the people around us. It's a good reminder that even when people seem to be moved by faith or miracles,
Right.
their hearts might not be truly changed.
That's a good point. But before we go too far, let's back up a bit.
Okay.
What actually led to this crazy shift from adoration to violence?
Well, remember, Paul and Barnabas had just healed that man.
Right. The man who couldn't walk.
Yeah, they healed him.
Okay.
And the crowd was amazed.
They were?
They thought it was a miracle.
For sure.
But instead of recognizing the one true God, the God of Israel,
Right.
they tried to understand it through their own pagan beliefs.
Right. Like they called Barnabas Jupiter.
Yeah.
And Paul Mercurius.
Which were the Roman names
Right.
for the Greek gods.
Zeus and Hermes.
Exactly.
It's interesting
Yeah.
how they tried to fit this event into their own understanding of the world.
It's like they couldn't imagine a god
Yeah.
who is totally different from the gods they already knew.
But Paul tried to correct them.
He did.
He said, "We are just men like you."
We preach to you that you should turn from these worthless things to the living God.
Who made the heavens and the earth and the sea and everything in them.
It was a powerful statement.
He was challenging their whole worldview.
He was asking them to abandon everything they'd always believed.
And that can be really threatening,
It can.
especially when you're talking about deeply held beliefs and cultural norms.
It makes sense that they reacted the way they did.
But it seems like for a minute,
Yeah.
the crowd was open to what Paul was saying.
Mm.
So what happened?
Why the sudden change?
Yeah, why did they turn on him?
Well, the sermon mentions that some Jewish people came from Antioch and Iconium
Okay.
and started spreading rumors.
About Paul and Barnabas
Yeah.
trying to turn the crowd against them?
It's classic misinformation and fear-mongering.
It is.
Shows how easily people can be manipulated.
It's a reminder that even when things seem peaceful,
Yeah.
prejudice and hostility can be simmering right below the surface.
Waiting for the right moment to explode.
And that's exactly what happened in Lystra.
Sadly.
Paul is stoned, dragged out of the city,
Oh, wow.
left for dead.
Really makes you think about the price people pay for their faith.
The courage it takes to stand up for what you believe in.
But even in this moment of despair,
Yeah.
we see the resilience of the human spirit,
Right.
the power of faith.
What do you mean?
The sermon points out that when Paul's followers gathered around him,
Okay.
he got up
He got out.
and went back into the city.
He went back
Yep.
after being stoned.
He didn't let this experience break him.
Wow.
It's almost like a resurrection,
Yeah.
a symbol of his unwavering commitment to his mission,
Even facing death.
even facing death.
And the sermon connects this
Yeah.
to a passage in 2 Corinthians
Okay.
where Paul talks about being caught up to the third heaven.
Right. It sounds like he's describing a vision.
Yeah. Or a glimpse of heaven.
And the sermon suggests that this might have happened soon after the stoning,
Imagine.
going through something so traumatic
Yeah.
and then being given a glimpse of eternity.
Like a reward for his faithfulness.
Yeah.
A reminder that his suffering had a purpose.
It makes you think about why Paul faced so much opposition,
It does.
especially from his own people.
Right. From the Jews.
It all comes back to that central tension we talked about earlier
Paul's message of grace.
versus the Jewish emphasis on following the law.
Paul was basically saying salvation is a free gift.
You don't have to earn it.
That's a radical idea.
It is.
Even today.
It challenges that human instinct
Yeah.
to try to control things.
To earn God's favor.
I can only imagine how disruptive that message was.
Especially back then.
It completely changed how they understood God.
Right. And how he relates to us.
It challenged their identity,
With traditions.
everything they knew.
It's like he was saying the rules have changed.
The game is different now.
And that's bound to cause conflict.
It is.
And this wasn't just a theoretical conflict.
No.
It had real consequences.
For Paul
Yeah.
and the early Christians,
He was constantly facing threats and persecution.
imprisonment.
It's amazing that he kept going.
It is.
Where did he find the strength
For resilience.
to endure all of that?
Well, the sermon offers some insights into that.
Okay.
It explores what fueled Paul's unwavering commitment.
I'm ready to hear more.
Let's dive in. So before the break, we were talking about what made Paul so resilient.
Yeah, like what kept him going?
The sermon suggests it wasn't just willpower
Mm.
or a stubborn personality.
Okay, so it sounds like we're about to find out what really drove him.
It seems that
What
way.
kept him going despite all the danger and opposition?
Well, the sermon highlights this passage in Philippians,
Okay.
where Paul talks about how he sees suffering.
Okay.
He says, "For to me to live is Christ, and to die is gain."
Wow. That's a powerful statement.
It really gets to the core of his commitment.
So it wasn't about staying safe
No.
or achieving success in this world.
It was about something much bigger. It was about completely identifying with Christ, believing that his life had meaning,
Yeah.
even in the face of death.
For Paul, following Christ wasn't just a set of beliefs.
It was his whole life,
Yeah.
his passion,
It makes sense that he wasn't afraid of suffering.
or even death.
But this brings us back to that question.
Which one?
If Paul's message was so life-changing,
Yeah,
why did it cause so much conflict?
especially with the Jews.
The sermon looks at this by examining the cultural and religious context.
Right. So remember,
Okay.
the Jewish people had this long history
Yeah.
rooted in the law of Moses.
Those rules that governed every part of their lives.
Exactly. Their identity, their sense of belonging, their relationship with God.
He was all connected to the law.
So when Paul said that salvation was a free gift from God,
Yeah.
not something you earned by following the law,
It challenged everything they knew.
it's like he pulled the rug out from under them.
And the sermon points out that this wasn't just a theological debate.
It had real-world consequences.
Like what?
Well, the Jewish leaders had a lot of power,
Okay.
and they saw Paul as a threat.
It's like anytime someone challenges the status quo,
You're going to get pushback.
but even with all the opposition,
Paul never gave up.
what kept him going?
The sermon highlights a few things.
Okay.
First, his relationship with Jesus.
Right.
Remember, Paul had that incredible encounter with the risen Christ.
On the road to Damascus.
That experience changed his whole life.
So it wasn't just about rules and doctrines. It was about a personal connection with God.
A God who loved him, guided him, and empowered him.
That relationship helped Paul through so much.
Loneliness, imprisonment, suffering.
He knew he wasn't alone.
He had Christ with him.
The sermon also talks about the support Paul got from other believers.
Right. He wasn't doing this by himself.
He had friends, companions, other missionaries.
They journeyed together, shared burdens, encouraged each other.
It's a good reminder that we need each other.
Yeah.
We need support, accountability, encouragement.
And the sermon mentions one more thing. What's that?
The hope of eternity.
Paul believed that this life was just temporary.
A prelude to something greater.
That eternal perspective gave him strength.
It helped him see beyond the trials of this world.
So as we wrap up,
Yeah.
what are your takeaways?
I think for me, it's the reminder that true faith isn't just about believing certain things.
It's about a change that happens deep inside.
It changes our values, our priorities, how we see the world,
And that change helps us face challenges with courage.
resilience, and commitment to our calling.
Even when it's tough, even when people don't understand, even when it costs us everything.
It's definitely a challenging message.
But it's also inspiring.
It makes you think about what sacrifices you might be called to make
To live out your faith.
in a world that often prioritizes comfort and security,
Paul's life shows the power of the gospel.
to transform people and change the world.
It's a story that still speaks to us today.
Makes us ask ourselves,
What does it really mean to follow Christ?
in a world that often rejects him.
Thanks for joining us for this deep dive.
We'll see you next time.